Thank you very much, Honorable John Anderson. I'm wearing a bright coat, but I suppose one thing that you could not tell and remains a secret until I say so is that part of my umbilical cord is buried in a Lower Guero village in Zimbabwe, just at the doorstep of my grandmother's thatched hut, which has got cow dung polish. And one of the most exciting debates I've had with my 3 teenage children recently was that they are better citizens than me because of my rural roots. And being their mother, I managed to win the debate by telling them that part of their umbilical cords are probably swimming in the sewage in Bulawayo City because they were born in town. So I remain connected to agriculture. My connection with the family smallholding farm in Lower Guero and my admiration for my grandmother, who was fondly known as Gogo Mayembe, continues to inspire me in my daily work 37 years after her passing on at the majestic age of 110 years. She remains my hero. On her 1 hectare holding, which was carefully divided into the residential part, 1 acre, the remaining 1 acre totally dedicated to farming. She was able to colorfully plant a diversity of crops that turned out into rainbow colors of maize, yellow millet, sweet sorghum, a vegetable patch with red, yellow and green vegetables, an orchard with large mango trees interspaced with smaller oranges, lemon trees, and guavas, which we could eat ad lib. At the far back end of the homestead, there was a kraal which kept our goats, which was our source of meat, our 2 dairy cows for milk, and 4 oxen that provided draft power for our planting seasons. The chickens were free-ranging, providing eggs for the family, and only rarely when my dad visited did we have the luxury of enjoying the chicken soup when most of the meat was for him. The commonly eaten meat was goat meat. 1 slaughter per month was enough to suffice for the whole family because we dried the meat, and just on the first day, we would have the intestines for our fresh meat. The rest was dried. Gogo Mayembe's farm was a source of food, but also our pharmacy. She made sure that all her 20 grandchildren worked on the farm. 3 times a year, we would come from the city for our school holidays. From Bulawayo, drive at the back of a truck, all 20 of us, to go and provide free labor and enjoy learning and working with my grandmother. When it was the January school holidays, it was exciting time because that will be the time for weeding. Every one of us with our hand hose would be following behind grandmother, 1 line at a time, making sure that we carefully weed and remove all the weeds from the farm. March holidays was exciting time because that would be the time for top dressing just before the harvest. We would walk with a bag of fertilizer, a teaspoon in our hand, per plant, 1 teaspoon cap on the side of the plant, with grandma watching to make sure there was no wastage. Finally, harvest time, August, the school holidays. We're excited because as we harvested the maize cobs, you got a chance to put 1 in your bag and roast in the night when grandmother was sleeping. That was the agriculture I experienced in Zimbabwe at the time. But what was exciting, when we left the village and went back to the city, Grandma made sure that we took back enough supplies to carry us throughout the school term. Unfortunately, the reverse is true now. We have to buy food to support our kin in the rural areas. We were a big family of aunties, uncles, cousins, brothers and sisters, all resident in the same farming homestead. All 20 of us would participate in both the growing of the food and the preparation of the food during mealtime. Dinner was the main meal and always served by my grandmother. The serving portions were carefully measured to avoid waste. They provided sufficient for each age group. There was always one piece of meat per person. My dad, of course, got more, and we know that. My grandmother, Gogo Mayembe, would always say, eat just enough so that you leave room for your stomach to breathe. When food was ready, we all sat on the cow dung polished floor, facing Gogo in a half-moon fashion, in a designated group of girls alone, boys on their own, the younger children, and the nursing mothers would sit closest to her with their children on their laps so that she would supervise the feeding and make sure that the children were well fed. It's no surprise, therefore, that most of my generation that were raised by grandmothers came out to be big Zulu girls and boys, bright students at school, and had a well-balanced, well-fed livelihood, and we were well-nourished. I went to college in the 80s to study agriculture. I was lucky to benefit from post-independence beneficiary governments who gave Zimbabwe scholarships for us to go and study. Since I had always wanted to be an air hostess, when I saw my name in the newspaper that I had been awarded the scholarship, I didn't think twice. I left the country to go and study. When I got to Egypt, I was given a choice between dentistry and agriculture. I didn't waste a second to think. I followed my passion, mostly because that was the year my grandmother had passed on. So I felt, in respect and in memory of her, this is the right thing to do. This was much to the surprise, maybe disgust of my family and my friends, who thought, who on earth goes to study farming? Up to this day, I'm still asked, so what is different from the agriculture you learned at school and what Gogo Mayembe used to do? Unfortunately and sadly, I have very little to show for my continent. What I learned in college was totally different from what I had seen practiced by my Gogo on her farm. I learned that back in the 60s and 70s, there was a green revolution in Asia. This green revolution was able to avert disaster, mass starvation. Unfortunately, Africa had not benefited from this green revolution. The continent had not benefited from the great breakthrough of the 60s and 70s. The African continent was left behind for several reasons. The high-yielding crops focused on irrigated cereals, which were not very suited for our agroecological conditions, where only 10% of irrigation coverage was and still is at present. There were failures in infrastructure then, and they still are at the moment. And policy challenges made it such that markets were not functional, and they still aren't. So, what else did I learn? I also learned that through the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, some 30 out of the 53 African countries are producing less food per head of the population than they did in the 60s, and it's still a challenge now. I also learned the concept of food security, which, according to the FAO, originated in the mid-70s in the discussions of international food problems at a time of the global food crisis. The initial focus then was attention on primarily food supply problems, of assuring the availability and to some degree the price stability of basic foodstuffs at the international and national level. Food security was defined then through the World Food Summit of 1974 as availability at all times of adequate world food supplies of basic foodstuffs to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption and to offset fluctuations in production and prices. By 1993, when I graduated with a PhD in agriculture, there were up to 200 definitions of food security, which to me was a clear demonstration that there are differing views and there is a problem. However, the definition that acquired the broadest acceptance was the FAO definition of the World Food Summit of 1996. And this defined food security as the existence of the food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, to safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preference for an active and healthy life. I underline active and healthy life. So when I graduated with a PhD in animal science, I was so sure that the Majele goats that were dished out by my grandmother at 1 piece a day would increase in productivity, and I, for one, would afford my family lots of meat every day, and it won't be rationed. When I got home in Zimbabwe, my nephew Moses had taken over the family farm and indeed was practicing the FAO agriculture revolution of more. He had cleared the entire farm. He got rid of everything that was not giving him money. The whole 1-acre farm was dedicated to corn. There was no space for produce with no commercial value, such as fruits, the vegetables, the millet, and the sorghum. They were all gone. The goats had been sold off one by one to meet household cash needs and pay school fees and hospital bills. Income from farming was used to purchase hybrid seed and fertilizer, but most important, to push him up the development ladder. And to him and many more in the village, development was about getting off the cow dung polished floor and buying a dining room table. It was about buying a television set so that they could enjoy the entertainment in the evenings. What was strange for me, though, was that the yields for maize that Moses was getting from the farm were dwindling and were close to half of what my grandmother was getting. In a bid to supplement his income, Moses left the farm to his wife and his 2 children, and he went off to the city to get a job. 3 years later, he still couldn't get a job, and he decided to move from Zimbabwe to South Africa and look for greener pastures. He never got a job. Now, Moses' wife is left in the village. Just like my grandmother gave us everything she produced, all the food came from her farm. Moses' family is dependent on the maize that is produced. 3 times a day they have a meal of corn, and the maize gets thicker as the day advances. Thin mealie meal porridge for breakfast, thicker porridge for lunch, and even thicker for dinner. And what goes with it? If they are lucky to buy cabbage, that's what goes with it. If it's the wet season, it's the naturally growing amaranth vegetable that they harvest. But most of the time, it's maize, and maize. This is true not just for Moses' family, but many others. The low yields made Moses abandon the farm. But what's more important is that his family now has had to remain on the farm because that's the only profession that they have ever known. Unfortunately, to this day, Nagabegi, Moses' wife, remains on the farm with his 2 children, who are now school dropouts. They continue to farm under rain-fed conditions using recycled seed and no fertilizer. The obvious reason for dropping out of school is lack of school fees. But when I visited the family farm recently, armed with a better understanding of hidden hunger, I asked to see the baby clinic cards, and much to my horror, I discovered that both children are stunted. Their birth weights were under the normal median curve, and their growth rates never pushed them beyond what is expected. But sadly, no one ever explained this to Moses' wife, because the children were round, they were fat, and according to any naked eye, they were thriving. The effects of malnutrition in most of the villages are only diagnosed when a child is then taken to hospital due to diarrhea, dehydration, respiratory diseases, and only then do the nurses eventually say, "What exactly are you feeding your children on?" Unfortunately, Begi and Madube's children are not the only stunted children in Africa. The reality is horrific. Nearly 1 in 3 children's deaths in sub-Saharan Africa occur in the first month of life, and 64% occur within the first year. Up to 35% of the deaths among newborns and young children have malnutrition as the underlying cause. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region where the number of stunted children is growing. Immediate causes of stunting are poor maternal nutrition and poor health during pregnancy, poor infant and young feeding practices after birth. Research evidence shows that malnutrition is more severe at the level of poor rural households and smallholder farm families, the very people who are supposed to be producing food, not just for their families, but the whole country, are the ones suffering from malnutrition. Recent estimates of the prevalence of stunting and micronutrient deficiencies rank Africa as having amongst the highest rates in the world. The largely irreversible damage of infant-child undernutrition on growth and cognitive functions impairs human productivity and could lead to a reduction of at least 8% in a nation's economic development. My recent experience in Tanzania and Ethiopia demonstrates that there are no special winning foods for children in the rural areas. They eat the same food as their adults. In a class of first and second grade children, up to half of the children I spoke to had come to school without having breakfast. The reason being the parents leave at the break of dawn to go to the fields, and there's no one to prepare food. Another 1/3 had had food, but this was leftover food from the dinner. This would be just plain rice or plain maize corn or teff in Ethiopia, mostly with no protein, just the cereal and water. To make matters worse, I've now learned that the lifelong sentence is not just stunting for these children, but new evidence now suggests that the stunted children are likely to become obese as they grow up to be adults. As food, most cases the wrong type of food, becomes available, they compensate by eating more and becoming obese. On obesity, the statistics are just as harrowing. Worldwide, obesity has more than doubled since 1980. The worldwide prevalence of obesity more than doubled between 1980 and 2014. Surely there is something that we are doing wrong, particularly those tasked with producing food. The cost of obesity and overweight-related non-communicable diseases was estimated to be $1.4 trillion in 2010. In 2014, an estimated 41 million children under the age of 5 years were overweight or obese. In Africa, the number of children who are overweight or obese has nearly doubled from 5 million in 1990 to 10.6 million in 2014. All this, we say, is a sign of development and affluence. As people become rounder and fat, it shows they are well fed. This we need to reverse. Nearly half of the children under 5 who were overweight or obese in 2014 lived in Africa. And in 2014, more than 1.9 billion adults, 18 years and older, were overweight, and of these, 600 million were obese. 39% of adults aged 18 years and over were overweight in 2014, and 13% were obese. Most of the world's population live in countries where overweight and obesity kills more people than just being underweight. There is no one country that is different. We are in it together. In 2015, approximately 795 million people did not have enough food, whilst 1.9 billion were consuming too much, manifesting in micronutrient deficiency, macronutrient deficiency, and overweight and obesity, the triple burden of malnutrition. What has caused this wicked problem? It then begs several questions that we need to answer. What is agriculture doing for nutrition? In our commitment to a healthy planet, as enshrined in the 2015 Paris Agreement, we may also ask the question, what are we doing for our planet? I'll speak for myself and be the first to confess that after 25 years of development research work in agriculture, it is only in the last 2 years, whilst working on the Agriculture to Nutrition project, that I've come to understand that what food security and nutrition security truly means to the individual, and that we certainly need nutrition-sensitive agriculture. It is only now that I have broken the silo to understand what, in terms of the World Health Organization, is their perspective when it comes to food security. Unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to say, as an agriculturalist, they've done better than us who produce the food. According to the WHO, food security means that all people at all times have both physical and economic access to enough food for an active, healthy life. The ways in which food is produced and distributed are respectful of the natural processes of the earth and thus sustainable. Both the consumption and production of food are governed by social values that are just and equitable, as well as moral and ethical. They talk about the ability to acquire food being ensured. The food itself should be nutritionally adequate and personally and culturally acceptable. And the food must be obtained in a manner that upholds human dignity. Surely, we need to redefine what we mean by food security and nutrition security. The challenge that we face is really about perspectives and our siloed approach to development. I spent my whole PhD working on the productivity of small ruminants, the indigenous Majele goats, focusing on how best I could feed the pregnant goats during pregnancy and lactation to make sure that I reduce mortality, get high birth weights, and make sure that we have more goats. Little did I know that the more meat and the more milk was hardly ever consumed by the right people in the household. That last mile is where most of us in agriculture really go, into the household, to understand what happens. We've left this to social scientists, and there are too few of them who understand the dynamics at household level. Agriculture must have the culture of giving dignity to the individuals that we aim to feed. In addition to healthy people, there is a component that both the FAO and WHO definitions don't address, which is the issue of the environment. We've not been able to address the component of a healthy diet holistically. This then means that there is something in agriculture that we are not doing right. That last mile is the road that we need to push into when we talk research for development in agriculture, in environment, in health, and in food systems. A food systems approach prepares and creates those opportunities. How best then can agriculture deliver these positive nutrition outcomes? We have shied away from talking and engaging with behavior scientists who will make us do the right thing. We've actually let the health sector promote nutrition-specific interventions to deal with diseases that are created by agriculture. We've allowed the breast is best message, as pushed by the World Health Organization, to be the one that's well known rather than food is our medicine. We have not taken lessons in saying, what is it that our agriculture can do? We have not thought about those mothers and the families that cannot purchase the vitamins that are promoted. Surely, just like my grandmother's farm was her pharmacy, all farm families can produce nutritious food and healthy foods. It starts with healthy soils, fortified seeds, fertilizers, appropriate harvesting and storage technologies, processing, fortification, cooking, preservation, and most important, the right policies that should be in place. I'm excited to have had the opportunity to learn from the best, working through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on Nutrition Project at Fanpan. I have learned how agriculture programs can be designed to be nutrition sensitive and deliver positive nutrition outcomes. Through working with the Eat Lancet Commission under the guidance of Dr. Gunhild, Professor Johan Rockstrom, and Professor Walter Wallet, I have learned that indeed we can have healthy diets and a healthy planet if we acknowledge what to do and are prepared to change behaviors and have a policy environment that penalizes the bad and rewards the good. The new narrative, therefore, should be agriculture for healthy diets, agriculture for a healthy planet. An Atunu farmer in Tanzania coined it very well, Kula kwa afya si kwa njaa, which translates to eat for health and not for hunger. Africa needs an agriculture transformation that embraces lessons from the Asian Green Revolution and crafts its own uniquely African Green Revolution. This one will be different. It's got to be smallholder driven, it's got to be climate smart, it's got to be nutrition sensitive. Let me share with you what I believe is needed. 5 things. First, we need to restore the dignity of the smallholder farmer. Farming must be a profession of choice and not for the poor uneducated. I'm happy to say a lot of effort is being put by strong farmer organizations that are going into electronic tagging to identify the bona fide farmers in the rural areas, looking at their asset base and making ways to retool through innovative finance and insurance packages. Number 2, we need robust non-state development-oriented institutions that can holistically drive the development agenda and promote the upscaling of what works. The era of pilots and small projects is gone. Let's take what we know works and put it to scale. Number 3, we need technologies that are packaged and promoted through advisory services. Number 4, we need private sector that drives functional markets. 5, and most important, we need functional, accountable governments with good policy and regulatory services that will leave space for private sector to thrive, but at the same time be true and accountable to serving the people. All of this is what Australia does very well. There could be no better time to make things happen now worldwide. Under the Paris Agreement of 2015, we collectively committed to a better and climate-smart agriculture. This speaks to conservation agriculture, where you in Australia are the champions. It speaks to water harvesting and conservation techniques, where you are the champions. This speaks to precision farming and drought mitigation, where you have left an indelible mark. Second, the Sustainable Development Goals speak to partnerships, and there can be no one institution, no one country that can make it alone. We are in it together, and no one should be left behind. Finally, it's the decade on nutrition. The UN has declared 2016 to 2025 as the decade for action on nutrition. There is no excuse and no room for agriculture that does not deliver positive nutrition outcomes. Let me whisper to you as to why the time is now for Africa. According to my predecessor at AGRA, Dr. Akina Desina, who is now the president of the African Development Bank, Africa has 65% of the uncultivated arable land left in the world to feed the 9 billion by 2050. So what does Africa have to do on its agriculture to make sure we have a food-secure world? Africa is the continent that will have the same population as China and India have today by 2050. Africa is the continent that will be the most youthful continent in the world by 2050. It makes sense, therefore, that I, together with everybody else, put our efforts in making sure Africa works. We need to industrialize our agricultural sector to unlock wealth. We need to achieve this through not just the staple crops, but all the diverse crops in our gene banks that we have not invested enough to make sure there is diversity in our diets. We need to attract private business and agribusiness and get them to locate in rural areas. We need to create market pool for produce of farmers and reduce the high post-harvest losses in the supply chains. In so doing, we're going to turn the rural areas from zones of economic misery to zones of economic prosperity. Africa already has some formidable institutions. The Pan-African Farmers Organization, under the leadership of Theo de Jager, a South African farmer, is doing sterling work in organizing farmers across the continent. The Forum for African Agriculture Research, FARA, is driving strategic science partnerships designed to respond to emerging opportunities. Under the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, CAADP, led by the African Union, there are new declarations and commitments to make agriculture the benchmark for African economies. On the policy front, FANPAN is the multi-stakeholder platform that is bringing governments and civil society to design evidence-based policies. And Grow Africa Partnerships has brought in 200 private sector companies into 12 African countries to make formal commitments on respective country investments in agriculture. And my new organization, AGRA, is designed to be an alliance, has attracted the largest collection of agricultural technical experts on the continent, with areas of specialization that include the full value chain from developing seed varieties that are adapted, fertilizer blends, agronomic best practices, and connecting farmers to markets, all in an effort to make sure that Africa thrives. It can be done. It's been done. Under the leadership of Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who left an indelible mark in Rwanda as the Minister of Agriculture. AGRA is well positioned by having divisions of government support, division of technology, and a division of private sector involvement to make sure that the African Green Revolution does not remain a dream, but is a reality. All I can say is that Africa is more than ready for win-win partnerships. The new narrative for nutrition-sensitive and climate-smart agriculture is forging new partnerships of learning together and sharing experiences for healthy people and a healthy planet. We owe it to ourselves, as stunted children of today are the leaders of tomorrow. with whom you will have to sit around the table to negotiate deals. We cannot afford that. They may be the immigrants of today, but tomorrow they may be the citizens that can bring hope to their own countries and dignified economic migrants. As we enjoy our dinner tonight, think of Moses and his corn porridge and cabbage just to fill his tummy, and also his two children, Begi and Madube, now 17 and 15, physically small for their age, just like many other children in the village, but sadly, you and I know better that they are stunted for life. Their cognitive capacity is compromised. Worse still, their mother, Mrs. Moses, is obese, but has recently been diagnosed with diabetes. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a lifelong sentence that has been caused by bad agriculture. We need a new narrative to end hunger, one that speaks to quantity and quality, a narrative that breaks the old way of thinking, a narrative that ensures healthy people and a healthy planet. The agriculture I learned at college spoke to quantity on the assumption that once there is more, people will have income to buy the right food. The agriculture that my grandmother taught me was about quality. We need to end hidden hunger. We need to increase yields. Yes, I agree. We need to promote diverse diets. We need to empower women and make sure women are getting into pregnancy healthy. They're staying healthy during pregnancy, and they're staying even healthier as they breastfeed up to the second birthday of their children. This is the first 1,000 days that was pushed by the health sector, and we pushed back on the agriculture side, not knowing it's talking about the food we produce. We need a new definition of food and nutrition security that relates to individuals. It is the nutritional status of the individual household member that is the ultimate focus. And the risk of that inadequate attention is something we cannot afford. Let's make food our medicine and reduce the ballooning health bill fueled by bad agriculture. I believe we can end hunger, particularly in my continent, which is lagging behind, if we do what we know is right, if we forge responsible partnerships, both in government and in the private sector. This is the sweet spot that will open the way for an agriculture that is impactful and can lead to a new narrative for a uniquely African green revolution, and end not just hunger, but eradicate poverty. We owe it to ourselves. I'm sure my grandmother, if they do smile wherever they go, would be smiling if we all commit to that. But better still, Sir John Crawford would also be smiling. I thank you.